Hello and welcome to Crisis What Crisis. I'm Andy Coulson, a former newspaper editor, Downing Street Director of Communications and one-time inmate of HMP Belmarsh. Over the last 6 years, I've put all of my experience, the good and the bad, to use as a strategic advisor to business leaders. And I can tell you that the bad has been just as useful as the good. And it got me thinking that there are plenty of great podcasts out there where you can hear the stories of great success, but there are far fewer where you can benefit from the experiences of those whose lives have properly unraveled. So on this podcast, you'll hear from the embattled and stoic, the shamed, courageous, ruined, damaged, unlucky and lucky survivors of crisis, all talking in the hope that they might serve as a useful guide to anyone facing down their own demons and challenges. Crisis What Crisis is generously supported by Mindstream, a brilliant company who harness the power of music for personal well-being and improving human performance. Just search for Mindstream, that's Mind with a Y, on Spotify, and you'll find some great playlists. I'm delighted that my guest today is Sebastian Coe. We talked just days before the start of the Tokyo Olympics, an event, of course, that's been beset by crisis for the last 18 months. As a member of the Olympics organising committee, Seb gives a pretty sharp view on that challenge and not unreasonably, I think, raises the issue of consistency of policy, something that's front of mind for us all right now. But it's Seb's personal crisis story that I think is the really fascinating and valuable aspect of this podcast. Double Olympic gold medalist, politician, campaigner and driving force of the 2012 Olympics, Seb's amazing career has been a tale largely of triumph. But more recently, as president of World Athletics, he's known controversy and personal crisis. And in this conversation, he describes the 2 years of legal drama over the Russian doping scandal as the most difficult of his life. And as is so often the case on this podcast, when it comes to explaining how he got through it, the conversation turns to the past, to his upbringing and specifically to his father, Peter, who was also, of course, his trainer. There is, I think, a straight line to be drawn from his father's dramatic wartime experiences and the resilience Seb demonstrated so many years later as his own integrity was being questioned. But I was also really taken with Seb's formula for crisis management, both organisational as well as the personal. And at the core is remembering who you really are and where you want to be when the crisis is over, but also to maintain a sense of the absurd, as Seb puts it, that ability when in crisis to say to yourself, okay, what is happening here is beyond comedic, but it is happening. So get on with it and get through it. That really resonated with me. So another episode packed with useful guidance, but also just a great story of a remarkable life. My thanks to Seb, and I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Seb. Thanks so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good, Andy. Great pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Well, it's great to have you. It's great to have you here. Thanks for giving us the time. I say that because, of course, we're in the midst of a brewing crisis with the Tokyo Olympics right now, less than a month away from the start. The rise of Delta variant cases causing real concerns about crowds, about attendance. And aside from your role as president of
it doesn't seem to have affected it too badly in the European Football Championship.
It doesn't. No.
It does appear that we're being held to a slightly different set of standards.
Well, this is the point. I should explain that aside from your role as president of World Athletics, you're also an IOC committee member. So you're at the heart of this sort of live crisis.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the point, really, is that it seems that we are in a world of contradictions right now.
Yeah.
What's right in one country is not necessarily right in another. I mean, how are those, and you're among them, those that are trying to make sense of this and make the plan work, if you like, how are you approaching it?
Well, it's complicated, Andy, and I'm not going to, pretend it isn't. The challenge we've really got is to deliver games that are fundamentally safe for the athletes and also fundamentally safe for those communities that are going to host us. Mm. And you, of all people, would get the communications challenge around that. And look, I was in Tokyo relatively recently, We went there for the test events, both in the stadium, and then we have our road events, marathon, race walk up in Sapporo. And the reason they moved to there was, it's genuinely thought that it might be cooler up there in the height of the Japanese summer, and just be a bit, a little bit safer for the welfare of the athletes. But the real challenge is making sure that you have got those two horses, stabled away. And the real challenge, of course, is if you're not communicating the thousands of hours that have gone into the forethought that is being, utilized around these, it's very easy to assume that this is a games like normal. It's not. I often listen to people saying, well, you've got 10,500 athletes just descending on Tokyo. Actually, they're not. They're going to arrive at the airport. They're going to be bubbled. They're going to be taken from the airport direct to the village. Their day in the village is going to be literally the village, unless they're competing, and then they'll go to the venues. There are no karaoke bars here. There's no wandering around the imperial, gardens or eating after the event. They can only be in up to no more than 5 days before their event. If they get bombed out in the heat after the first day, they don't share the Olympic experience of being there throughout the competition. They're back home. So it's going to be a challenge. And then, of course, we've only just heard that the Japanese we can have fans in the stadium. Again, that's still to be determined in what proportion. The only thing I would say is the athletes have got rather used to this environment. They have, in the last year or so, certainly in my sport, been competing in large part in front of empty stadiums. There hasn't been an obvious diminution in their performance. And again, if I'm being a bit blunt here, that the athletes that are going there with real medal pretensions are actually, under any circumstance, not really worrying about whether they're out able to buy souvenirs or sending postcards. They're really just focusing. It's their job. I mean, they're focusing on that. And I think, if anything, in the last few years, people sort of say, well, it must be a real challenge for athletes. Actually, athletes are far better positioned than most people to work remotely, because they've always done that, and they've relied very heavily on technology. Most athletes are working with coaches that are not actually based often in their own shores. Of course. And the second a training session is done, you might be sending the video 8 time zones, and you're sitting there sort of comparing notes and building for the next day. And if you look at athletes at trackside, particularly the technical events, the first thing they do when they've done a high jump or thrown a shot put is to literally walk across to the perimeter where their coaches are. And the coaches have already got it on video, and they're looking at, the technical issues and seeing what they can do. So in a way, this is not as strange for the athletes as you would think. But yeah, nonetheless, this is not going to be a games as usual. It's going to be very unusual.
Yeah, and pretty complicated for the politicians. This idea of trying to perform in the midst of a crisis, an Olympian crisis, of course, is something that you've got rich experience of. But I want to talk about that in a moment, if I may. First of all, I'd like to talk about resilience, Seb, and that means going right back to your upbringing, to your dad, Peter, a remarkable man, an engineer by trade, but he was also your coach, of course, self-taught.
Was.
Using innovative methods that hadn't been used, controversial methods, I think, that hadn't been used in Britain before. But he also, it seems, instilled a resilience in you as a result of his own experiences during the war. Am I right about that?
Yeah, you are. Although, interestingly, it was only sort of, relatively recent. I say relatively recently, 20 odd years ago, that we properly understood what his war involved. Just in simple terms, he was in the Merchant Navy. My dad was quite belligerent about all sorts of things. He joined the Merchant Navy because he for all his life, Andy, he was an unreconstructed socialist. The morning that I announced around the kitchen table in Sheffield that I was throwing my hat in the ring as a Conservative member of Parliament, I don't know who was more shocked, the mayor of Sheffield or him.
Do you remember the words?
No, I do remember. I do remember on the eve of the 1992 election, which was my first election.
Yeah.
He rang me up in Cornwall. I was the candidate down there, and he said, "Look, I've thought long and hard about what I'm going to say." And he said, "Look, as your father, I suppose I wish you the best of luck." And then there was a sort of slightly pregnant pause, and he went, "And I hope you're the only one in there at the end of the evening." So he was funny. I mean, he had a very quirky sense of humour, but he was also tough.
Tell us the story, because it's an incredible. Well, I mean,
he was in the Merchant Navy, and in simple terms, he got torpedoed in the Atlantic on a food run out of the US, and he survived an improbable length of time in the water. There were 200 people, sadly, on the boat that didn't make it. He made it with about 4 or 5 people, including the ship's chaplain. There may be something to be said for spiritual underpinning on those moments. And he was picked up by a German battleship, a well-known boat, the Gneisenau, and he was taken to La Rochelle, which was then German-occupied France. And became very friendly with a guy on the boat, a guy called Eddie Shackleton, who was actually a Canadian, a few years older than him. And he always said actually the best part of his war was on the boat, because he was of that generation that was taught German in school. So he did speak German, and he went into the kitchens. But then he came ashore, and word got out that they were being sent off to a pretty draconian prisoner of war camp near Hamburg. And in simple, just being simple about it, he jumped off a train, and he walked by night, slept during the day, both of them. And then they separated because they felt it was too obvious. After months of walking, I mean, literally living off the land and anywhere they could sleep at night.
And so he's kind of 19, 20 years old?
Yeah, he's 19 or 20. So he decided to go. And so Eddie decided that he wanted to try and make it to Marseille. My father wasn't really sure whether at that point it was occupied or not. So he took the tortuous route of clambering his way through the Pyrenees, and then got promptly arrested. I shouldn't laugh, but he then got promptly arrested in sort of Franco Spain without the right papers, and then that was a pretty unpleasant 6 months.
Yeah.
And my grandmother, I mean, talk about resilience. So they sort of had a funeral at the Port of London for people. He was sailing Blue Funnel Line, and my relatives pretty much all went. My grandmother refused to go. She said he's going to turn up. I had the letter at home from the War Office, basically saying that, we have to conclude after 6 weeks or whatever it is, lost at sea, that, sadly he's been claimed. She would not accept it, Andy. She just would not accept it. And she said, "Nah, he's coming back."
Wow.
He's absolutely
how long was it before
it was about a year.
Through? Right, a year.
It was about a year. And he then, he was eventually released from Spain and reunited and sent home. And he was, his health was absolutely shot to pieces. So that was pretty much the end. So, whenever I've been in a tight corner with him, and he would, when we were having arguments inevitably with the athletics authorities, which he loathed authority at the best of times.
Yeah.
And, I remember him absolutely cutting loose on my behalf on some occasion. And I looked at him we were all shell-shocked. And I said, "You don't scare easily." And he laughed and looked at me. He said, "The last 45, 50 years have been a bonus." He said, what have I got to lose? So everything he did was imbued with that view that he was actually lucky to be where he was. He was lucky to have 4 kids all doing different things. He was lucky to be,
but the strength of, because of
working.
Of course, that generation of
he never talked about it, interestingly. It actually came out quite circuitously. My grandmother said something, and we all sort of sat there going, sorry, what are you on about? And then she brought out a couple of newspaper clips that sort of talked about it. And it was a front page of the Daily Express. And, so I've always sensed that generation that really did go through the mire tended not to want to talk about it. It's always in life, isn't it? The ones that are sort of slightly embroidering the story that are the ones that want to, become the raconteurs. He never discussed it, and he was deeply shocked. I remember when the Belgrano was sunk in 1982, 83, whenever the Falkland War was, and there was an element of sort of euphoria, and I remember him being deeply depressed at the thought. I think he probably understood the reasons behind it, but being deeply depressed, having been in that situation and watched so many people he knew lose their life at sea.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because these days, of course, we're told that we must talk about these things. That when we've been through crisis or we've been through a stressful time, and very few of us have been through anything that could possibly compare with what your dad went through. But the idea now is that we must share and we must open up, which you've got to believe, obviously, is the right thing to do. And yet, your dad was able not just to kind of survive and get through the day. He was a remarkable man, channeled his energies into so many different things, you included, obviously, and very successfully. I mean, where have you sort of landed on that bit of it? As one of our previous guests said, when we were discussing whether it's kind of biography or biology, is it a bit of both? Is that where you are, or where are you on it?
I think it's inevitable. I mean, I'm an interesting suffusion because, my father was sort of East End and came out of a very, very modest background. He was born on Cambridge Heath Road. Always interesting to me that's exactly the part of the world that I ended up being part of the team regenerating.
Yes.
But, his father was a railway labourer, and my grandmother was a cleaner. And yet he marries my mum, who comes from comes from a family of writers and portrait painters.
She was an actress, right?
And she was an actress. Yeah. She was RADA trained. So it remains an absolute mystery to all of us. And nobody has actually really ever got to the bottom. Sadly, my parents aren't around any longer, but it's always remained a mystery to all of us in the family as to how they ever actually, how or wherever they met. But they were an amazing combination. And I think I sort of got, and my mum, of course, I have a lot of it, I have Indian heritage. So my grandfather was Indian.
Yes.
So my mother was born in Delhi and brought up until she was 10 in Delhi, and then came back to the UK as an evacuee. She went up to Northampton. So she sort of she was born in Delhi, born in the hotel that my grandparents had. Mm-hmm. And then she came back to the UK and then was suddenly shunted up with a sister to Northampton. And then, went through school and then ended up at RADA and did a lot of repertory theatre in Birmingham and Worcester.
Yeah.
And there was my dad, who, was a racing cyclist who spent most of his life on motorbikes. I mean, I'm told their first date was he took her on an aerial square 4 down the Portsmouth Road at about 100 miles an hour. And my sisters told me that she actually said she didn't speak to him for 3 months after. She was so appalled at his idea of a night out. But no,
so the resilience that you have, and we're going to talk about that, but the resilience that you obviously have is, as you say, a combination of all those things.
Yeah, I think it is. But
added to that, your own experience, of course.
Look, I think the human condition is its landscape, its geography, its family, its friendships, its influences.
Yeah.
And, mine were, I was very lucky. I had they were both very loving parents. They were quite bohemian in their way. They introduced me to jazz clubs, which is my passion is jazz. They introduced me to jazz clubs at the age of 11 or 12. I was sitting, social services would have had a fit if they'd known sort of some of the clubs I was sitting in on a Sunday lunchtime watching George Melly in New Merlin's Cave in Marjorie Street, sadly no longer there. And to this day, to this day, that is my passion. I'm forever indebted to it. But also my mother, because I was brought up in the People's Republic of South Yorkshire. So the Halley Orchestra used to come every 2 or 3 weeks to Sheffield. So my father was, we were busy on Sunday nights in local clubs listening to jazz. And on a Friday night, I'd be listening to something like the Lindsay String Quartet or the Halley Orchestra. So I was very, very lucky to have them there. And they were also, people misunderstood my father. He had a massive hinterland. Sport was not the only thing he ever thought about. And in fact, racing cycling was his passion. Yeah. Towards the end of his career, he wasn't a great one for journalists, but towards the end of his career, rather reluctantly gave an interview, I think it was to the Times. And they said to him, at the end of my career, they said to him, do you have any regrets? He said, yeah, my son never won the Tour de France, which sort of slightly threw them off balance. But and his interest in athletics was because my mum couldn't figure out where on a sort of Sunday morning and a Tuesday night and a Thursday night her son was going, deep into inner city Sheffield to spend hours, with a local athletics club. And I think she sent him down there to find out what on earth was going on and whether I was sort of, I was actually where I was supposed to be. And then being a classic engineer, he just sort of watched what was being, how some of the coaching techniques, and decided just to dismantle it. It didn't seem to make a great deal of sense to him. And then for the next 5 years, he just basically immersed himself in everything he possibly could to understand the nature of the event. The endurance of it he didn't find too complicated because he was quite comfortable about riding to Brighton and back in a few hours. He was a member of Herne Hill Wheelers, a pretty good South London cycling club. But it always made me laugh. One of his closest friends in Sheffield was head of languages at Sheffield University. And when this guy was supposed to be on holiday or probably having a relaxing evening, my father would sort of trot across with the latest text in German or Russian or whatever it was. So he'd end up translating all this stuff. And he just was voracious about what he studied and then started to practically apply it. And it didn't go down well. I remember him virtually being in a punch-up with some parents. I won a Sheffield Schools cross-country race with about a minute and a half in front of, the nearest kid. And they sort of came rushing over to him and said, this is outrageous. You shouldn't be doing this to a young athlete. My mother was quite, unbalanced about it. And she sort of stepped in there to keep them apart. But that was, what he was doing was so different that it was interesting. It then, it spooked people. And everybody talks about, doing it differently, challenging convention, the status quo, leaving the herd. It's far harder to do it in practice.
Yes.
Because you then, you are under, basically we are all under a lot of pressure not to do that.
Yeah.
Convention says you don't sort of wander off.
Certainly
too far off
well.
due north. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, British athletics threatened to, at one point, British athletics were so shocked by some of the things he was doing in training that they threatened threatened not to remove his insurance that allowed him to train on public. And this is
in simple terms. Parks. In simple terms, his theory was that you needed to be pushed. It's sort of with a fairly scientific approach, but you need
but not needlessly. I mean, it was careful because for instance, there was a great deal more thought that went into it because he was an engineer. He also understood the load on joints and pistons. So I used to train a lot in the Peak District, and whenever there was a really long, unremitting downhill slog, his view was, why would you want to put young joints through those types of pressures? So he'd make me get in the car, drive me to the bottom of the hill, and then we'd go. So for my training runs were never down, they were only ever uphill.
Yeah.
But there was, he, you know, we talk about marginal gains now. I mean, he was really the creator of that kind of concept.
Let's talk about the 1980 Olympics, which was a scene of triumph for you and your dad. Gold in the 1500 metres, silver in the 800 metres, but all against, and we touched on this earlier, all against a backdrop of international crisis with 66 countries, including America, of course, having boycotted because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Of course, the Americans are now leaving Afghanistan. But what do you remember about that, Seb? Did it feel like a backdrop of crisis? You've just talked about the challenge that's going to be facing, you know, our Olympians in Tokyo. But, you know, there you were in 1980, very different circumstances, but surrounded by international crisis. How did you cope at the time? Do you remember?
Look, I'm digging deep a bit here. It's you know, it's north of 40 years. But interestingly, I'd actually graduated that year. And I did political sciences, economics. So I was following that quite closely. And I do remember, I think it was Christmas Eve, actually. I mean, the Russians do tend to do things on public holidays. Anyway, it was Christmas Eve when we all sort of, you know, heard that, you know, they'd invaded Afghanistan. And I remember instinctively feeling really queasy about it and thinking, you know, this could really escalate into something quite serious. And my instinct at that point was already that sport was often the cheap vehicle by which you want to make your gestures. And, you know, we'd been through the 1976 boycott because if you remember, the All Blacks played a South African side, breaking what was effectively the Gleneagles Agreement. And then African nations asked the IOC to tell New Zealand they couldn't compete in the games. The IOC did not accede to that, and then a lot of the African countries boycotted, including Kenya. So we lost some pretty serious head-to-heads. John Walker actually won the 1500 metres, but there were other African athletes in that race that would probably have given him a very good run for his money, and we missed out in the 800 metres. Mike Boyd, probably one of the great 800 metres runners of all time, didn't make 76 either. So we sort of got familiar with the crisis of politics in the Olympic movement. So my instinct was this. I think most people were not looking at it from a sporting perspective. I was. And I remember sitting up in Sheffield over Christmas thinking, this is going, you know, there will be a political backlash here. And if you remember, I mean, it was the fledgling months of a Conservative government. Margaret Thatcher was determined to sort of build on the US UK special relationship. And the second that Jimmy Carter called for the boycott, I really sensed that we were going to be in difficulty, because there was no way that a British government at that moment wasn't going to probably fall in behind. And I think any British government of any political persuasion would probably have done that. And then it started, and it became really quite unpleasant. Newspapers took sides. I remember some of the younger members of the team being sent photographs of atrocities in Afghanistan. A very young athlete, Lindsay McDonald.
Yeah,
there was a lot of pressure, and I sort of, because I tend to be outspoken on things, I guess, and I've broken 3 world records that summer, so I was obviously. I think you would recognise the £50 notes of journalistic currency. If they could get me on record for that, that's quite a big thing for somebody who just won the BBC, Sports Review of the Year. And I did go into battle on it, because I just didn't understand I thought it was intellectually dishonest. I didn't, historically, I had real questions about it, because I don't think boycotts actually achieve what they set out to do. And I ended up really, in large part, at the target of, interestingly, some of the sort of right-leaning newspapers who, really, really challenged me on it. And for me, the moment that I absolutely became unreconstructed on this was we were all being told we couldn't go because by going, we were implicitly supporting a Soviet regime, which was, again, just incoherent. But the same week we were being asked told not to go, BP signed some big pipeline deal with Russia, and the Bolshoi Ballet arrived in London.
Yeah.
And I thought, this just doesn't... I think Andy, I think in hindsight, it would have been a more difficult decision had the response been more holistic and more across the board. But it just looked that sport was the easy gesture. And as my father at the time rather famously said, look, if your neighbours are burning down your house, the logical response is not to stop your children playing with their children. It's actually to do something about it. Don't use sport as the vehicle. And then he got called in by Douglas Hurd, a young Foreign Office minister, and asked to silence his son. And it's all in the 30-year papers. And
just remarkable, because you're what age? You're a successful athlete.
I'm 23. And interestingly, I then went on to become a government whip, and for a short period of time, I guess by implication, a minister in a government that I was, was challenging. And then I sort of ran slightly foul of them again on my slightly outspoken views about apartheid as well. So I really, how I even got selected for the seat that I did off that backstory was quite interesting.
Well, in the midst of all this, you're winning a gold medal. I mean, how do you strip all that away? I didn't appreciate it. It's just how much of it must have been swirling around your head. I knew that these things were happening, but I didn't realize so much of it was.
Yeah,
how do you then strip all that away?
Well,
to race on that day in the way that you did.
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't think it's remotely comparable, because I think the athletes that have had to weather the storm in the last year and a half have had one more potent ingredient than I had to deal with back in 1980, and that is that every time I stepped out onto the streets of Sheffield to run 10 miles or whatever it was, I knew that there was a chance that that training run was not going to lead to anything, because I might not have been going. But I didn't also, at the back of my mind, have the fear that I was going to get infected, or worse than that, probably infect an elderly member of my family. Yeah. That's what this generation of athletes that have had to deal with this crisis have had over and above anything that I had to deal with. But no, there were some days openly where I would sit and think, well, this is my third training session of the day, and I'm sitting here in January, and the odds of going are looking pretty remote. We had a remarkably strong chairman of the British Olympic Association at the time, who was actually it always amused me. It was Dennis Follows, and he was really an old-fashioned, municipal conservative. And I think Margaret called him a communist, which always amused us all. But he was absolutely resolute on this and said, you can decide what your policy is, but I'm going to leave the individual athletes and the individual sports to decide whether they go. So athletics went, some other sports didn't. And again, it was complicated, because if you were on the public purse, there were plenty of friends of mine who were, civil servants or in the police service or in the military that didn't make it to Moscow. And so I do remember some days sitting at the end of a training day thinking, I've done 3 training sessions. I can barely open the door to the house. I'm so tired. But sort of sitting there and wondering whether or not.
But what about the day itself? What about the race itself? How were you able to kind of clear, such a long time ago, I appreciate, but how were you able to clear all that away?
Well,
and run the race you ran.
Moscow for me was really a tale of 2 races. And the first, the 800 was by my standards, not a good performance. I know it's slightly precious to say that, I got a silver medal and was disappointed, but I guess life is only about whether you know, if you know you've fallen so well below what you are capable of, then you are the only arbiter of that. It's not for journalists to write, or you know, they've got every right to write it, but ultimately nobody needs to tell you that you've screwed up. You know that yourself.
Yeah.
So for me, the Moscow Games probably came 1 year too early. I was inexperienced in championship racing. I'd broken world records, but going, Andy, off to Oslo or Zurich, and sometimes being able to pick the time of the day for the race, even pick the field. You've got pacemakers. You remove so many different variables. Championship racing is the litmus test. It is the toughest environment, and the step up from a one-day event to a championship is like, you know, stepping out of non-league football and into the England football team. It's that big a chasm. And so I lost the 800 in Moscow, and I take nothing away from Steve Ovett. He deserved to win the race. He was far more accomplished. He was mentally tougher and physically in better shape. So I then had 3 or 4 days to try and get the knitting together. And the only thing, looking back, I always smile at one of the exchanges. I didn't have a lot of discussion with my father because classically as an engineer, he always took the view, you know, why use one word when none will do? And I remember him sitting in the village in Moscow at an old plastic sort of trestle table. And there were and it was when the journalists could wander in and out of the village. And I remember sitting with a few like Colin Hart, The Sun, David, John Rodder, the Guardian, lovely writer, David Miller, who I think was writing for the Telegraph at that point. And they were all being helpful and constructive and giving all sorts of advice about what I needed to do in the 1500 to bounce back. And my father sat there sort of just listening to it. And then while all this was going on, he pulled an old piece of paper out of his pocket. It was the back of an envelope, and an old propelling pencil. And he started life as a mathematician, so numbers for him were, if you couldn't measure it, don't do it. It's, you know, he had to be able to measure it. And at the end of about 10 minutes of all this advice, he looked at them all. He said, right, thanks very much. I now need to speak to my athlete. He never referred to me as my son because he did actually coach other athletes. Right. And he looked at me and he had this piece of paper, literally, and he sort of said, look, it is so simple. And he got all these numbers on the back. I mean, it looked like a spreadsheet. And he said, it's so simple. He said, I've just figured it out. He said, given the number of mistakes you made over the distance that you made them and the frequency with which you made them, it is well nigh statistically impossible for you to fuck up that badly again in the next decade. And that was the team talk. And I looked at him and I went, yeah, okay.
Was there a hint of a smile? No,
I mean, I laughed.
Or a fatherly wink?
I laughed. But he said, look, it's here. It's in numbers. So just go out and, just run. For God's sake, just run and free yourself from it all. Yeah. From it all. And actually, it was very good because, he made some fairly critical remarks after the 800 meters, which, not even on this podcast can I repeat. But the issue for him was, and it was really important, and I think this is one of the things that I've noticed in a crisis, when you're in there, you're all in it together. It wasn't he loses, we win, or I win, he loses. He took it really seriously because he said, look, I'm coaching somebody who on paper is 2.5 seconds faster than anybody else in the field. And I can't absolve myself of the responsibility of the way you performed. And to his dying day, he sensed the night before the race that I wasn't in absolutely the right frame of mind. And again, he said, it's the toughest coaching decision. I talked to Eddie Jones about this, and he said, your father had classically the worst coaching decision to have to make. And that is, do you risk actually saying to your athlete that you sense that they may not be in the right frame of mind and, have the discussion? And if they think they are, then you've introduced something that they probably haven't even thought about. Or do you know instinctively it's not quite right, but say nothing at all?
Yeah.
And to his dying day, that was the one thing that he regretted, jokingly apart, other than the Tour de France, was that he didn't actually tackle it that night.
Yeah.
And he said, I think had we sat down and discussed it and talked about it, he said, I think the result might have been different the following day. So really, after that, I had 4 days before the final, 2 or 3 days before I got back into competition. And I just kept sitting there reminding myself of the 3 principles, I think, around any crisis, which is, how did you get there? Once you've sort of figured that out, don't dwell on it. There's nothing you can do to alter that. That is history. It's done. You can get into it. You can get into a loop, but you have to concede, and then you move on. And then you've got to decide, frankly, where you want to be. Where do you want to be at the end of the week? And I didn't want to go home empty-handed. I really didn't want to go home empty-handed. I've been doing that for 12 years. That wasn't my idea of a of a successful campaign. And once you figure that out, well, then figure out what is it you're going to have to do in the next few days to make sure, you don't screw up again. And in large part, I think it was just coming to terms and sitting there, just reminding myself about the thousands of hours and the thousands of miles on the roads of Sheffield and the Peak District and the weight training room, to the point, where you've lifted so much you can't actually even grip the steering wheel in the car. Your hands are so clawed with cramp, you can't even drive. And just remembering that actually all that is in the bank. That's what you've done. And, it sounds a bit of a sort of David Colemanism, but you don't become a bad athlete overnight. And that's what I just kept reminding myself, that I'd gone too far to allow this moment to sort of dribble through my fingers.
You won, of course, gold and silver again in the Los Angeles Olympics in '84, set 12 world records during your career, many of which stayed for a very, very long time. You stopped competing in 1990, I think, after a run of injuries and illness also. Did that decision, that day, did that feel like a crisis to you?
No, actually, funnily enough, it felt like the most normal thing. And I'll tell you how that happened. I got dropped from the team in 1988 because I probably had another argument with the federation. I remember, foolishly, you would not have advised me, had you been my communications director at the time, you would not have advised me to go on to BBC to argue toe-to-toe with the chairman of selectors at the side of a track in athletics. And he famously said to me, this is not about it. There's a much broader picture here. He said, this is about who runs the sport. And I said, well, when you find out, could you tell us? Because the athletes have been asking that question for at least the last 20 years. Well, he did actually have
all on television.
On television, live on the BBC, and he was the casting vote.
Yeah,
he was the casting vote. I lost out on selection that year, 12-13. It couldn't have been tight, and his was the casting vote. I had a good season in '89, and in the lead, I remember it was October, November, towards the end of the coming year, and I was running along the towpath. I had a house in Twickenham, and I was running along the towpath at the end of a training run, and it was always that stage of the season. It was October, November, where I could always picture doing something different in training to be better this time next year than I was now. And I can remember it like it was yesterday. It's the one thing I do remember, because there was mist on the river, and all you could see were the heads of the rowers. You couldn't actually see the boats. And I don't know why I started thinking about it, but about 3 miles from home, suddenly I just realized that in previous years, I could change some of the training. I could change the balance between endurance and speed and weight training. I could even change the training venues. I could even, I was lucky. I could even go and train overseas and do something completely different. And it dawned on me that there was nothing I was going to be able to do that meant I was ever going to run faster. And I knew at the time, I probably knew enough to still win races, but something went out at that moment. Right. And I literally got back to my kitchen, picked up the phone to my old man and said, "That's it.
Really?
I think I'm cooked." And I always remember him saying, he said, "Oh God, yeah, I think that's the right decision." I was surprised he went on after 1984, which was sort of slightly came out of left field.
Disappointing thing to hear.
I know. It's a big crossroads in your life, and he was sort of quite relieved he wasn't going to have to do the 7 o'clock mornings either.
You painted a bit of a picture for us, obviously your dad heavily involved in this, but I'm just wondering what kind of walking, once you got the seat, walking into Westminster, walking into the tea room with all those other Tories. I just wondered, how did you kind of deal with that from the get-go? I mean, you'd been around a few blazers, hadn't you? By that,
I had, but I wasn't
different.
I wasn't inside the Westminster bubble like a lot of people that were standing. I hadn't been a special advisor. I hadn't been a policy wonk at central office. I hadn't served on local councils. I hadn't come through that route. I'd obviously come through an entirely different direction. And I do remember, I do remember arriving there and sitting in the tea room with, some good friends of mine that are still very good friends of mine. People like Alan Duncan, Charlie Hendry, that were in that intake, and they all sat there saying, "Oh God, it's very like being back at school." And I'm thinking, I went to Tapton Secondary Modern in Sheffield. This has got nothing. My school. This is nothing like. This is nothing like my school. And then we all got sort of shunted into Committee Room 14 when the Chief Whip came in and all gave us a sort of career development conversation about, attending votes and all that sort of stuff. And everybody walked out, I think, looking, the colour of the pale wallpaper. And I thought, well, if you've been in a call-up room 40 minutes before an Olympic final, I'm not going to walk out of here feeling too worried about it.
We're going to very rudely rattle through those 5 years and go to 97 then. Just quickly, when it happened, when the moment came, and you weren't alone, of course. It was a seismic change. How did that feel? Because obviously you'd been thinking, right, well politics is my future. Did that have an element of crisis for you?
Well, yes and no. I mean, interesting, somebody said to me, "When did you think you were going to lose the election?" And I said, well, actually, the night I won it, because I only had 36.8% of the vote in a very tight three-way split. So I was 3,000 and little bits ahead of the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour Party were only 700 behind them. And I thought, over 5 years, what could easily be a very challenging 5 years as they turned out, that I just sensed that I probably wasn't going to hold the seat. I mean, I worked very hard to try and hold it, but it wasn't going to happen. And then it was a weird election because I had Peter de Savary, who stood as the embryo referendum party. Right. So he stood. I had old Labour, I had new Labour, I had old Liberal, I had new Liberal, I had Freddie Zapp, Miss Whiplash, I had Natural Law Party. I mean, there must have been 15 candidates. Yeah. And then Tony Blair very helpfully created Emily's List. So they then put in Falmouth and Campbell was the seat they road tested Emily's List. So in the county of Arthurian legend, I thought that sooner or later my time would come. I just didn't think I'd be taken out by a lady called Candy from Islington, but that's another story.
There you go. I mean, you stayed in politics. You worked with William as his chief of staff, again in some, I imagine, fairly choppy waters. Not the easiest of time, almost glorious of times for the Conservative Party. Every day a drama, I imagine, in that job. What was your approach then? How was having given us a flavour of the approach you took as an athlete, what sort of approach are you taking now, in politics towards crisis?
Not to be overwhelmed by it, and that's more easily said than done. If I look to just sort of cast the view forward a little bit, the one thing that I think helped us in world athletics is from the very outset, I said to our teams, we've got to be a two-speed organisation. Yes, we are being engulfed by something that is quite different. We've never experienced this. We've lost events. The athletes are not training. We've lost the games. We've got some really serious financial issues to deal with. So let's deal with them. Let's secure the tent pegs. Let's make sure we do everything that we can to secure the sport. But let's not also forget that we don't want to be so consumed and subsumed by it that we're not doing all the things that we need to do to create some sustainability in the sport. So even through that crisis, we still delivered, in the last year or so, we still delivered a 4-year strategic plan, a 10-year sustainability program. We created a welfare fund for the athletes. We were still dealing with the Russian doping crisis. We're the only federation that's been really very tough about that. We created a new racing format, the Continental Tour. So the one thing I would say, and look, I'm not an MBA, I'm not a Harvard grad, I'm not a management guru here, but it does strike me that organizations that maintain a really clear view on what they still need to do in that crisis to not just navigate their way through, but go on creating those opportunities that make you a better organization this time next week than you are now. And it's very, very easy to get so tied into the immediacy of everything. And so in a way, that time with William was, I found very, very energizing, because that was always my approach. And William. I mean, William is one of the calmest people and emotionally even-keeled of almost anybody I've ever worked with or known. I mean, there was a lovely cartoon that he still has in his house. I think it's a Times cartoon in the early days of his leadership, where there are about 10 absolutely similar pencil sketches of him in little boxes, and it's got the same face, and it's William irritated, William angry, William happy, William calm, and he is remarkably good in those situations. And just creates an air of calm around him, and that actually suited me. I think had I had to work with somebody that was forever flying off to the margins of a problem and not being able to see the bigger picture, that would have been, I don't think that would have worked.
We talk about that a lot on this podcast, is that crisis invariably, it's a human process, obviously, right? And in politics in particular, certainly in business as well. Perhaps we'll get onto this when we talk a bit more depth about sport. But in the end, it's a bunch of people in a room trying to solve a problem, right? Yeah. So how all those people behave, and indeed who's in the room in the first place, which can be a very difficult thing, because there are people who believe they've got the right to be there and are of no use or of any help whatsoever. Equally, there are people who are often excluded who should be involved. Yeah. I mean, that element of it, you obviously take very seriously. The kind of team element of crisis is critical.
Absolutely. And I've been in situations where I've sensed that I've got people in the room who are not trying to find the navigable route through, but are frankly, trying to find the nearest lifebelt. And I always remember, it's probably not pristine HR, but I remember when I was chairing the London bid, which, I came to relatively late. We weren't doing that well. There were 5 global runners and riders. It started out with 9. We snuck across the line in an initial evaluation as 4th, possibly even 5th out of the Parises and the New Yorks and the Madrids. And then I got asked by Tony Blair to sort of take over on the bid when my predecessor, who did actually a very good job in creating a startup, which is what a bid is, but I think he recognized there needed to be a slightly different emphasis. And I do actually remember going around the 60 or 70 people when I first joined and asking them what they wanted to do after the bid. And all those that said to me they wanted to go back to Deloitte or Goldman Sachs or wherever, Transport for London, I said, go now, because you clearly cannot, you're not imagining us winning this, are you? Mm. And all those that said to me, I'd love to be a director of transport, or I'd love to be involved in bringing communities together in East London, they're the ones I said, fine, that's great. You can see a win here. Mm. You can see the future. Mm. And
so you started with a cleanup.
Yeah, I did. Mm. You had to, because some just, I wanted to know that people were there for a bigger, bolder purpose.
After the Olympics, of course, you move on to other senior roles in sport, including, of course, as president of World Athletics. Sport seems to be in a sort of continual cycle of crisis. Often those in charge are accused of being the sort of last to accept or to see that there's a problem or a crisis. Perhaps the sort of brainless European Super League is the latest example.
Yeah,
I mean,
isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, is it fair to be so critical about leaders in sport and crisis, or is there a kind of inevitability about it for all the reasons that we've discussed, earlier in this conversation? The overlap with politics, the overlap with so much in our lives, we look to sport. I mean, is it fair to be so critical?
No, I don't think it's unfair. And I think criticality is important. I live in a country that I'm actually quite proud that people question. Mm. It doesn't bother me. I think it's the last vestige of normalcy and democracy. Yeah. I think people should, in positions of influence, be held to account. And if you can't, I always smile when I hear politicians saying, oh, I'm not going on the Today programme. I'm not doing that. They're normally the ones that are not masters of their brief. If you go on and what you have to say and you're confident about it, then you shouldn't actually be under pressure. I don't also think there is in most cases an inevitability about crisis. Everybody says, oh, it came out of left field. Rarely does it come out of left field. You've got, there are traces that if you sit and you're honest about it. And look, my presidency in World Athletics couldn't have started in a more inauspicious way. I got elected in Beijing at the World Championships. I took a week or two's holiday. So it was a 2-year long campaign. I came to this office I'm sitting in today. And literally 2 mornings after I arrived here, my receptionist came in and he said, look, there's a delegation to see you. I thought, well, that's nice. It's, in Monaco, it's the headquarters. It's probably a slice of cake and a glass of champagne. I had 17 policemen in the lobby. I was then introduced to a guy called Judge Van Renbeck, who was the senior prosecuting judge for cross-border corruption in France. And in simple terms, the crisis started to unfold. I then, sat down with them for a few hours, and over the course of that, it was explained that my predecessor had been arrested in Paris that morning. His son was on the run. My head of testing was also arrested. The legal counsel was arrested, and my CEO had decided to go backpacking in Australia. So it wasn't the opening paragraph of an obviously happy ending. Out of that did come...
just stop. Can we stop there just for a second?
Yeah.
That day, right? Just that in that moment, how were you organising your mind? What was your approach?
My first instinct was to be very protective about the people in the organisation, because I knew that this was not a bad organisation from top to bottom. What was clearly obvious and has subsequently emerged from World Anti-Doping Agency inquiries and our own internal investigation and a French court case was that, and again, it drove the reforms that I pushed through. But what clearly had happened is there were two circles of governance, and too much power was residing in the hands of too few, where decisions were at best opaque and at worst, just made within a very small circle of people. And there were not enough safeguards or protections in the organisation. So I then had, in one sense, yes, it was a crisis. It was a crisis of a full-blown nature. It was absolutely front page. I was, famously had a very big exchange with Jon Snow on Channel 4 one night. This was really serious. But my instinct was to protect the most crucial asset we had, which were the people in the organisation, because they weren't criminals. And to make sure that, and actually to never let a good crisis go to waste, I knew that this was the moment I could probably, frankly, take a flamethrower to everything and get everything I wanted through in change. So we created the Athletic Integrity Unit. We collapsed two constitutions into one. We drove it in the course. We drove it absolutely unflinchingly for 9 or 10 months. We got all the reforms through. And, it meant everything from checking the power that I now have as a president to make decisions. We now have audit. These are not revolutionary thoughts. This was just a sport that didn't have any of this. I remember the person who I asked to come in and look at this independently, after a few weeks came into my office and said, "Do you want the good news or the bad news?" And I was sort of trying to figure out what I wanted to hear. And he said, "They're the same." He said, "You could do anything you want in this organisation because there are no systems in place." So that was when we started to change. And we came through it. We're stronger than we were. We've in large part gained, our reputation back. That doesn't, as the Dutch fondly say, trust comes on foot and leaves in a taxi. And there were things that I was able to do because I seized the crisis and got people to accept things, if I'm being honest, Andy, that they probably wouldn't have done. And I couldn't leave it too long between problem and solution, because human nature tends to be, it'll be okay, another news cycle. And no, it wasn't going to be enough. Not because we couldn't have probably got out of the livid nature of it, but we wouldn't, we would still be vulnerable to that type of ailment. So it was probably, if I'm being honest, it was probably personally, it was probably the toughest 2 years I've ever been through.
Well, there were moments when your position, your integrity is being questioned, on the front page of newspapers, and for a fairly sustained period. How did that? First of all, the obvious question: how did that feel? For you, having had such an amazing career, suddenly you're being criticised in a way perhaps I don't think you've ever been criticised before. You're dealing with that on a day-to-day basis. How did that feel? First of all, how did you deal with it?
No, I'll be honest about it. There were days when you felt very vulnerable. You did, and I don't think I think people in leadership positions should never disguise vulnerability. I think it's really important in an organisation because I wasn't the only one that was feeling vulnerable. But the buck did stop with me. All right, I'd been a vice president of the organisation, but one of 5, and never been a senior vice president. But it didn't really matter. That's not where, I was the one that I'd got the job. And, famously, the question was, are you corrupt or are you asleep at the wheel? And actually, neither is the case, but that's quite a hard allegation when you're in the middle of it. I think it was Obama that once said this shit would be interesting if I wasn't in the middle of it. And, and it was select committee hearings, and, it was pretty non-stop. I did a 3-hour, 50-minute select committee hearing, which I have to say I didn't find it particularly illuminating, but it was, I was spending most of my time
How did you manage that sort of the physical impact of that crisis? I mean, the easy try answer would be, well, of course, you having had so much success as an athlete, you were kind of, you had the capacity to kind of dig deep and find your way through it. But I mean, it's of a different order, right?
It is, and I
totally different type of pressure.
No, you're right, and I did dig deep, and I did have the advantage of having been through, big moments. But if I'm being honest, they were very different. This felt very different to me, and you just woke up every day feeling that you were in the trenches, and you really were. And my communications team here was sensational. I mean, they absolutely were in the trenches with me, and the whole organisation sort of rallied round. But no, I mean, there were moments where I would wake up in the middle of the night thinking, is this sustainable? And you do, and you have to ask yourself the tough questions. And it's very easy to say, well, don't dwell on it. But actually, it's quite hard when, you are in that. It's attritional. It is day by day by day. And it. You've witnessed that. You've been at the heart of government. You know what it's like when you are firefighting. And it is mentally and physically, it is bruising. But I did always fall back on saying, look, it doesn't really matter in a way whether I survive, but I've got to survive long enough to put systems in place so that this can never ever happen again. And that's what drove me. I'm sure that is absolutely right, Seb. But you're also fighting for your own integrity as well, right? Yeah.
And as we've discussed, on this podcast, you've been generous enough to spend a lot of time with us talking about what has been an amazing career, and then suddenly you're sat in your office dealing with a moment like this, thinking, hang on a second, it can't end here. This isn't right. Is that part of the thought process for you? What, I'm not having it.
Yeah, but there were moments when I thought it might actually end, and you've been a comms director. You have to also give really strong, unvarnished views. And I've been lucky here. I have a terrific communications director, her, Jackie Brock Doyle, who never varnished the difficulty that we were in. I mean, I always knew that she had the street smarts and the comms expertise, not to sort of spin your way out. You can't spin your way out of those things, but, just to go toe to toe and slowly start redressing the balance. But I'm open about it. For some months it was really touch and go.
In those moments, you kind of draw on perspective, I suppose, it becomes very important. How are you finding perspective at that moment?
Not easy. I mean, you're sitting there knowing that you haven't been, well, you're part of it insofar as you were in the organisation. But I always remember taking some comfort from a forensic accountant we used Deloitte to really go through everything. And he saw me in a lower moment in the office, and he knocked on the door and he said, do you mind if I come in? And I said, no, come in. And he sat down and he said, look, this is going to be an entirely appropriate conversation, but I just have to tell you one thing. He said, I've unearthed a lot of things in organizations. Some of them have ended up on the front page in really high profile cases, and I've been doing it for 38 years. But on not one single occasion have I ever known corruption to be shared with co-workers. And he said, so I know you're sitting there beating yourself up, but believe me, the most important thing you can do is to put all those things in place that will prevent this ever happening in your sport. And he was nice. And he said, I think you've got the resilience to do that from everything I've witnessed in the last few weeks in the office. But no, it was tough. And I was also responsible in a way for the emotional balance of everybody else in the organization, because, we had people in that organisation that had worked there for 35, 40 years had never sensed that any of the things that were suddenly being spewed out in the media had been taking place. And, and again, with full anonymity for them, some of them ended up having counselling about this. It really hit the organisation very hard.
Was your dad's voice one of the voices in your head when you're wading through those waters?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. One of my treasured possessions is his stopwatch that recorded all my track performances and a few world records. And what people don't realise is for about 2 years throughout that, including appearances in select committees, I had that watch on the table in front of me. And the great thing about a stopwatch is it doesn't lie. Times you can't fudge anything. And I thought, if I've got that watch in front of me, just keep going due north. Just keep going due north. And actually, it was just one of those things. It was, it's an old-fashioned stopwatch. It was the old manual one.
Yeah.
But that, in a way, it was a bit like having my old man and my coach there. And the stopwatch never lies. Just,
Wonderful.
Just keep soldiering on.
Wonderful. Look, from such a sort of, rich career, Seb, how then do we distill down the sort of Seb Coe kind of crisis approach? Just try and strip it back and summarize it for me from all of those experiences.
That's a really tough one. I think for me, I've always clung to three things. One is when it does strike, be nimble, act really quickly, because problems are rarely, they're rarely incremental. They really do hit you exponentially. And so procrastination and pretending that, one more news cycle, or it doesn't work like that. So, I think that's really critical for me is being nimble and being the two-paced organisation that is dealing with the crisis, but not losing sight of what you are as an organisation. Secondly, it's early action. You've really got to tackle this quickly and hard, and also just don't be wedded to responses that you have started off with, because the circumstances will alter, and you do need to be adaptable. And finally, I think, just act wisely and create systems and structures that are going to allow you to do that. And don't, and occasionally, you just have to concede and move on. You know what it's like. You can go on arguing, you can go on fighting with your face because you think you're right, but that's not where public sentiment is. Mm-hmm. My political hero is Abraham Lincoln. And, the quote that I have up in my office, you can't see it, it's behind the screen, but it's, with public sentiment, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing will succeed. So you've got to be able to communicate, and communicate more during a crisis. People tend to communicate less.
Yes.
But you've got to be really
exactly
right. And everything you communicate has got to be accurate. So I think for me, it's having that vision that allows you just never to deviate from due north, however painful that is. And sometimes you just have to take it on the chin and concede and move on.
Brilliant. Seb, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope useful for anyone who's listening and who's interested in how you navigate a crisis, whatever its cause. Good luck with the Olympics.
Thank you.
But before you go, can I ask you for your 3 crisis cures, please? These are 3 things, as we always say, can't be another human being, but 3 things that you've kind of rely on in the tough times, in the dark days.
I think for me, friends. Everybody we all commonly say, oh, we've got, he's a great friend, she's a great friend. Actually, I think if you can count the number of friends, true friends, on the fingers of one hand, you're doing, throughout a lifetime, you are doing remarkably well. So I've got really close friends who, have always been really supportive and, will drop anything for you.
Yes.
The second one for me is music. You may or may not know, but I'm an absolute passionate jazz aficionado. I've got thousands of recordings and write and occasionally broadcast about it.
Yes.
So actually, I always find jazz the most mood altering. I walked from the warm-up track in Moscow to the final of the 1500 in the stadium, and I had an old Walkman. I was listening to a mix of stuff, and fortuitously on that walk, which is Arctic loneliness between a warm-up track and a main stadium, 100,000 people, and onto my Walkman came, I think it was Sidney Bechet, a recording of Just a Closer Walk with Thee. So I lean really heavily on music. And the final one is just recognize the absurdity sometimes of life. That, you just have to sit back and go, yeah, okay, this is just beyond comedic, and accept it for what it is.
Yes. Excellent. Seb, fantastic. Thanks so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Andy, pleasure.
It's all inside you, you just got